Welcome everybody to another episode of Dragonus Podcastus. My name is Tiffany. That's my name. Don't question it. And with me again is Queen Byron, Lordess, you could say, of all things creepy and scary.
Well, I think the female version of Lord would be Lady, but Queen is an elevated title, so you can refer to me as Your Majesty or Your Highness.
Oh yes, of course. Yes, anyway, if you guys enjoy our content, as usual, you can support us on patreon.com/Dragonus Podcastus. We are still promoting the, the Adventure Unbounded, which I have actually checked out the website. It's actually really cool. Byron, would you like to talk about that before we get started?
Right, so we're still recruiting a few new players. If you've never played D&D, now is a great time to join. We have a whole team of Dungeon Masters ready to help you build your first character or help you get started learning the rules. We have an amazing original setting that we developed. All of our games are run in the same living world, and you can play consistently with the same DM every week, or you can switch. We have a really fun and unique mechanism for having players switch different campaigns around. So, yeah, check out our website. It's in the description below.
Yes. So, Byron, do you believe in the good word?
What's that word, then? I thought the bird was the word.
Well, that too, but, do you believe in Jesus? Do you believe in God? Do you believe in the Holy Spirit?
Well, it depends on what character I'm playing.
Well, if you enjoy all that, then I highly suggest being a person of the cloth, because we're talking about Cleric, our first official holy class next to Paladin, but that's a totally different story. I just something to point out here. This is not necessarily this is more of a hot take, but basically, just a suggestion for anybody who actually wants to play Cleric. You don't necessarily have to be religious. You can still be a person of faith, but it could be you believe in a set of values rather than like a deity. That's actually a more idealistic way to play.
Yeah.
That's how I play.
So, in fact, in the Eberron setting, they don't have deities or gods that actually directly influence or interact with the people of that world. So any cleric in Eberron is really working on faith, just faith, whereas in Forgotten Realms, those gods can and do intervene in the lives of their subjects. So you can definitely play a cleric who lives or gets their powers on faith alone, on belief alone, without ever having seen or interacted with your deity.
That's actually really cool. So starting off as usual with our class analyses, I have one big question I always ask is, what is the biggest selling point of playing Cleric? Why would somebody want to play Cleric?
Well, I think that if you want to have a mix between support and buffs and debuffs, and potentially hitting like a truck, then I think the Cleric would be a great choice for you.
And what's the biggest difference between a Cleric and a Paladin? Because there's often a misconception that they're the same thing.
Yeah, so in earlier editions, they may have had a very similar kind of parallel class feature list. In 5th edition, a Cleric is a person of faith, like we were saying, a person who celebrates or worships a deity, whereas a Paladin is more of an oath. So a Paladin could have a deity in their background, or they could just have an oath for justice or for truth. And maybe there's not a god that they pray to or relate to. So Paladins have oaths, where Clerics do have religion and faith and a deity.
So they basically Clerics get their powers from their deity in a sense, and Paladins, they get their power from being from their oath, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So what are some of the big misconceptions and stereotypes that you often see with a Cleric?
Well, I think that a lot of people assume, kind of like what we were talking about before, is that you have to personally be a person of faith. I don't go to church. I don't really participate in those kinds of activities, but I've played several Clerics, and I've really loved the class. So you don't necessarily have to be, like a prophet or, someone who, proselytize or tries to spread their religion. You don't have to play like, like a Mormon missionary or somebody who's going knocking on doors and things like that. If you want to play a class where you can heal people and help people, and like I said earlier, kind of sometimes if you really need to, you can hit like a truck, then I think a cleric is a great choice. You don't have to play as a religious fanatic. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And also, I've always been under the impression that like clerics are very, because of the nature of their spell list and their abilities, they're very much a anti-undead class.
Mm.
But I recently looked at the player's handbook. It's not just undead. It's
Mm-hmm.
fiends, abnormals, basically anything that's essentially evil in nature.
Yeah, but as we were saying, there's a lot of flexibility. You don't necessarily have to play as a religious zealot who hates zombies. Perhaps, your religion or your god has room for them in their belief system, and they're not a natural undead or fiends or whatever have you. Those are kind of the targets of some of the cleric's class abilities, but you don't have to be, like we said, kind of like a religious zealot. You don't have to be targeting those creatures all the time.
Exactly. And yeah. So do you think the class has any weaknesses, and if so, what would they generally be?
So while the cleric is really strong at helping people, healing, and doing buffs and things like that, the weaknesses kind of come with stealth a lot of times because they're usually wearing heavier armor or medium armor that comes with a stealth disadvantage. And if you are kind of building your character out to be, a good support character and healing a lot, then you may suffer in the martial department where you maybe don't do a lot of damage with a melee weapon or things like that. And then they are kind of dependent on their spells, their class abilities, and their channel divinity features and things like that. So not so strong in the melee department, but if you wanted to, you could build a cleric who was, and you could totally tank as a cleric, but then that would kind of come at the expense of some other features that you wouldn't have.
Yeah, so it's basically one big triangle of trying to find the balance between
Mm-hmm.
DPS, tanking, and healing, which is
Yeah.
basically every MMO in existence basically is based off of that. Like, for
Mm.
example, World of Warcraft has the cleric, and they have their different skill sets. So a lot the cleric is usually considered to be a support class, but it can go offense if it
Mm-hmm.
really wants to,
Mm-hmm.
and they can be spec'd into offense and like what usually it's in World of Warcraft it would be shadow magic, um but for
So,
oh sorry, go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say, so for clerics, they have a robust spell list, and they can choose which spells they want to prepare based on the number of spells they can prepare each day. They choose those at dawn, prepare those, and then they can cast those up to the number of spell slots they have. Some of those are super heavy hitters, where you can have like Moonbeam, which does a lot of damage. You have Spiritual Weapon, which is a bonus action to cast, and it basically almost acts autonomously. A weapon is floating in the battlefield somewhere, just whacking on the enemies every round. And then you have something like Spirit Guardians, which is a spell where spiritual energy surrounds the cleric, and any creatures that come into that area have to make a wisdom save or take a truckload of damage. So they can definitely be spec'd for DPS, like we said, but again, that triangle aspect where it may come at the expense of something else.
Yeah, yeah. Mm, what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, let's talk about the nature of their spells, because their spells are not divided up into schools. They're actually divided up into what is known as spheres, which is the same thing for druids. I think this is, I think this has been carried over from older editions, but that's what I remember from reading the ADD Player's Handbook. But basically, um, cleric spells are divided up into spheres, which have a variety of different and it's also dependent on your domain
Mm-hmm.
that you um that you dedicate yourself towards. Also, a cleric doesn't necessarily have to be like as we said, somebody of the faith. They could be like a teacher or somebody who just like spreads the good word, spreads
Mhm.
human morals and human values. But they would be considered, but in by our standards, they would be considered a cleric or some form of a preacher.
Yeah, I've played a cleric that was of the nature domain, and basically she worshipped Sylvanas, but more than that, she worshipped the natural order of things. So, you know, things like zombies and undead, she wasn't a big fan of because those things are unnatural. Whereas there was one time we were in a prison, and my character said, well, being locked in a cage is very unnatural. We should free everyone. Freedom is natural. Wanting to be free is very natural. So you can see her goals and her values were aligned with nature, and she could talk to plants, she could talk to animals, and she had a lot of fun doing that. But again, not so much necessarily of a faith, but trying to keep the natural order of things.
Yeah, I find like there are certain like things in media and in media where they either go way too heavily into the faith, or they just happen to be somebody who just preaches like the human morals. One good example of this that has been present since the beginning of time and beginning of the stories has been Friar Tuck. He's not necessarily, I would say, like the best representation of him was the Kevin Costner version. Now, granted, that's a bit of a the the Kevin Costner version of Robin Hood is a bit of a weird one because well, Kevin Costner's not pulling off a British accent, well, there, but it's filled with, it's got the bishop, and it's got Friar Tuck, and I think the way that the bishop is defeated is actually the most clever way to work around like the whole idea of clerics like fighting each other. When he says, "You will not strike a man of the cloth," he's like, "Oh yeah, you're right. Why don't I just give you? Why don't I just help you pack for your journey because you're leaving because the situation's gotten out of hand. And then here's 12 pieces of silver to pay the ferryman on your way to hell," and he pushes him out the window. Now, I'm not sure if that would be something like, would that be like that break, like not necessarily an oath, but that would go against a cleric's values. But if the cleric or the bishop in question is corrupt, then I could definitely say like, hey, this guy needs to be stopped, and you did it in an unconventional way. The alternative was basically either like dragging him off to jail and giving him a proper prison sentence. But in the time of Robin Hood, it's a little it's more about like trying to stamp out tyranny,
Mhm.
and also that the whole thing with the bishop basically saying, "Oh hey, it's for the best of the land that you married the sheriff of Nottingham." Yeah, I'm not even gonna talk about that scene, or even the fact that Robin Hood, like he's like, "On the sake of your souls, you will not shed blood in the house of God," and he slashes at Alan Rickman. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, something to take into consideration. So let's go over the abilities of the cleric. I'm actually kind of curious. What is channel divinity? Because I've always been curious about that one.
Yeah, so Channel Divinity is one of the main class features where they have special things they can do based on which domain they pick. A lot of times, Turn Undead is a Channel Divinity feature, but then depending on what domain, if you pick like Nature or Twilight or something else, it gives you specialized abilities that you can do. I believe they reset on a short rest, but maybe don't quote me on that. And basically, it's usually a magical effect that the cleric can do using their holy symbol and, channeling that divine power that flows through them. And they're really cool. Like, Turn Undead is a great one because it really makes, if you're facing, like, undead or any of the other creature types that are targeted by it, they really have to flee or they can't come closer to the cleric. So it can be a great way to do crowd control and things like that.
The power of Christ compels you. Oh wait. So, yeah, just let's quickly talk about the difference between turning undead and destroying undead, because there is a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So
yeah.
yeah, so the turn undead is kind of what I was saying, where they are forced to flee kind of from the cleric. They're afraid of the cleric. They can't move closer to the source of their fear. If you level up enough in levels of cleric, you may eventually get a power where, depending on the challenge rating of the undead creature, instead of being turned or scared of the cleric, they're just instantly destroyed. Which is really handy if you're dealing with like a bunch of low-level zombies, like a horde or something like that. If they fail their, I believe it's a wisdom save, they're just destroyed. They're just vaporized or disintegrated or however you want to flavor it. Maybe a flash of bright light, and they're gone.
That's a good distinction. I think the best thing about the cleric, in my opinion, is definitely they have like I think there's the best like middle of the road when early D&D came out, it was the wizard, the fighter, and the cleric, and the cleric was the best representation of the two extremes. And the fighter was basically the tank, and he was the brute. The wizard was the one who cast all the spells and did like insane amount of damage. The cleric was the healer and or the tank, and was more specialized. And then you have the rogue, who is just kind of more just there. And
Well,
in terms of alignment and like morality, um, the cleric and the rogue generally don't get along, because a cleric adheres to a certain standard, whereas the rogue is like, oh hey, there's a person's house, I'm gonna go rob it, or I'm gonna go break in and see if I can find something.
hmm
Um, I think my favorite ability from the cleric is definitely divine intervention. Literally calling upon the powers of Jesus to basically do something or to help you out.
So I have played several clerics, as I mentioned, and I've only ever used this. Oh, I've only successfully used this ability one time. We were at Strahd's Castle. I was playing in a Curse of Strahd campaign, and we had pissed him off, and he was looking for us. But we were on the ropes, and a lot of our abilities and spell slots were spent. So I used my Divine Intervention, and I basically asked my god Sylvanas to intervene and provide us with the ability to take a long rest. Therefore, we would gain all our hit points back, we'd gain our spell slots back, and all of our other powers. And I can't believe it, but I actually rolled in that 10%. And the DM narrated that kind of a pocket opened up, like a portal made of plants and things like that, and we went through this like vine curtain, and we found ourselves in a small room covered in plants. And when we stepped through the portal, the portal sealed up behind us, so we knew we were safe. We slept peacefully, and then we killed Strahd.
Yeah, that's it's interesting that like the cleric has like the biggest relationship, or the more anti undead relationship with like vampires, and because one thing about vampires is that they hate anything of like anything holy. So like say the crucifix, or a religion, or a stake, or even something blessed. Um,
Mhm.
I don't know if you know this, but in older editions of D&D, depending on your domain, you were restricted in your choice of weapon. Thankfully, though, they've kind of changed that. But it used to be so restrictive. You either had to dual class, or you had to devote yourself to the war domain in order to use a sword, which is
Mm.
which is kind of silly in my opinion. And speaking of domains, um, let's just quickly go through each of them. So there's knowledge, which knowledge is kind of self-explanatory. Life is basically all about keeping people alive and out
Uh-huh.
of the ground. Light is all about, well, lighting things up. Nature is um being in harmony with Mother Nature, and not pissing her off. Uh, What is Tempest? I'm curious about that one
Yeah.
actually.
So Tempest is the cleric domain that kind of deals with the elements. So you have nature, which is like plant and animal focused, but Tempest is more like the winds, the rain, lightning, and things like that.
Oh, okay. So trickery is all about, hey, look over there.
Mm-hmm.
And then we run away, basically, something like that.
Yeah,
War is self-explanatory.
that's
Order,
the DPS one,
yeah,
basically.
yeah. Order is all. I think order is all about like keeping the peace, or just keeping the law in like in check. I think a good example of a good like order cleric would be somebody like Judge Dredd, and I'm about to do the speech. I am the law. Drop your weapons. These blocks are under arrest. Um, just a side note here. That version of Dredd is not comic accurate. It's actually the 2012 version with Carl Urban that is actually it's actually much more faithful to the setting, and also because it's so good. Like, and the thing is that Carl Urban never takes off his helmet, which is exactly in line with Dread. Anyway, so peace is all about, hey, stop fighting, and then Twilight is basically the moon, which has moonbeam. Yay, yay,
Yep.
moonbeam. And then finally, uh, Forge is basically making stuff, and then Grave is keeping people under the ground.
And then you have the Arcana domain, which is more focused on magic and almost like very similar to a wizard with the Arcana flavor. And often overlooked one that's found in the Dungeon Master's Guide is the Death domain, which has a lot of like creepy, undead kind of spells and ones that inflict a lot of damage.
Yeah. Just a weird thing I noticed that a lot of healing spells are basically necromancy, and yet
Mm-hmm.
a cleric a cleric won't be caught dead using necromancy. So, I mean, is that just a mislabeling, or is that just a generalization, or is that just something that they did for convenience?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the design idea was there, but yeah, basically if you have a regular healing spell like Cure Wounds or Healing Word or something like that, it just gives hit points to people who need them, that's fine. But the spells that bring people back from the dead are considered necromancy. And on one hand, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because revivify and resurrection and things like that, you are bringing people back from the dead. They won't be zombies, they won't be undead, but those spells are labeled as necromancy. I'm not quite sure why they picked that of all things. And then you have kind of that idea that, like you were saying, that clerics don't traffic in necromancy. Well, I think that's partly true. They're not creating zombies. They're not creating undead creatures. But if your friend goes down and you have the ability to bring them back, and they will totally be their whole self with no modifications or lingering effects from having been dead, a cleric would do that. I don't know. I've never heard of a cleric who chose not to take those spells because they were labeled necromancy. That's kind of a game thing, like a kind of a meta thing. Every cleric I've ever played or known has taken those spells if they had the ability. The problem is really that the components are so expensive that they're almost prohibitive. Like, you need diamonds or diamond dust equal to 300 gold piece or more, depending on which spell of these type you're trying to cast. Revivify is the lowest level one, but you have to have been dead with just like a minute or something like this. So that's like a quick end of the battle type of thing. You have the resurrection and true resurrection, and those things they have a huge material component cost. I mean, it's just so expensive. But as far as the label, yeah, I'm not quite sure why they chose that, but I also don't know exactly what they would fall under.
I would say like healing or just regular old healing. Is
Mhm.
there like a spell that allows you to grow back body parts, or is that just considered?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Like, is that is that like under cure serious wounds, or is that more like
Yeah.
or is,
So
no?
yeah, so Cure Serious Wounds is a spell from an older edition. Yeah, I recognize that. So in 5th edition, you have Healing Word and Cure Wounds as like kind of the easy to access lower level ones, but you can always scale them and cast them at a higher level. But in order to regrow body parts or lost limbs, you need Regenerate. And that is a 7th level spell, so it's very high. It's considered transmutation magic. So again, it's not necromancy, so it's possible, to have these abilities without using necromancy. And the components are just a prayer wheel and holy water. So no cost associated with those items as the Revivify has and the Resurrection and stuff like that.
Okay. Okay. So before we end off and final thoughts here, is there anything you would change about the class or add to it?
Well, I'm not quite sure how you would achieve it, but some of the domains are way more powerful than the other ones. So, obviously, it was a character choice that I made, but I was playing a nature domain cleric in Barovia. That was the choice I made. I knew we were going to be playing Curse of Strahd, but I wasn't able to use my class abilities a lot because for people unfamiliar, there's not a lot of plants and animals in Barovia to begin with, which is what choice I made. But versus like a Twilight Cleric, which is considered one of the most OP classes or subclasses across the board. I just feel like there could be some better balance between the different subclasses because while it's fun to play against type or it's fun to play a character who maybe isn't like super great at everything and that's kind of min-maxing in a little bit, but there comes a point where it's just like it's too obvious of a choice where you just have to take the better choice because otherwise you really can't do much at all. So I just love to see some more balance across some of the different abilities.
Yeah, that's perfectly reasonable. One change I would make is I would take like the whole like being able to bless things, like say I don't
Mm.
know, like being able to bless weapons, bless a location, or maybe just like pour holy water on an area and say anything that comes within this with steps in this area is basically going to take damage.
Mm.
Oh, that's another thing. So basically, clerics they do radiant damage, correct? Usually.
Well, some of the spells they have can do radiant damage depending on what spell they're using.
Okay, and then some of them can use some of them can actually like some of them their spells do necrotic damage, correct?
Again, kind of depending on
It
which
kind of
spell they
depends.
choose. Yeah, if they have access to those.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. Okay, so final thoughts here. So in my opinion, cleric is a perfectly serviceable class. It's one of those classes that you you can play it. It's very flexible. It's you don't necessarily have to be religious. You could be, as I
Mm.
said, you could be a teacher or somebody who just um it puts human values ahead of everything else, and helping people. In my world, actually, while clerics, there's a difference between a medic and a cleric. A cleric will can heal, but they can't do surgery and they can't do like triage. But also, one thing I forgot to mention was that clerics also, because in some um mythologies and some in our own world history, clerics take death very seriously, so they make a point of granting last rites before the person. If the person is already dead, they give them last rites. But if they're about to die, they will give them last rites before they die, so that their soul is not condemned. Uh, okay, so what are your final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I love playing clerics. I think it's great when you can heal people, you can do damage if you need to. There's a lot of options, and it's really fun to do channel divinity and all those different things. Just pulling different things out of your character sheet, and it's a very effective class. They
Yes,
don't,
very effective.
and the last thing I will say is that nobody's mad when you roll up to the table with a cleric.
Yeah, unlike certain other classes that we'll talk about in future episodes. Clerics are actually, the like you need the cleric. You can
Mm-hmm.
Most parties cannot live without a cleric. Like it doesn't, or well, your party needs some form of healing. So
Right. Right.
and clerics are the best at healing, even though that is a stereotype and a bit of a generalization. But there's no other class that I could think of that does healing as well, if not more so, than a cleric.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And plus, I'm pretty sure clerics are the only ones that can resurrect people without consequence.
Well, it depends on the spell they choose. Sometimes there are consequences.
Yeah, we're not even gonna get into that. Anyway, so we'll see you guys next week. Hopefully everything works out. And just prepare yourselves. Things are gonna get super weird. We'll see you guys next time.
Bye.